Well, thank you, Katerina and Julie, for organising this. Thank you very much to the CCRI for having me today. Let me share my screen. Can we see that okay? We've got a thumbs up.
Yes, that's fine.
So yes, thank you very much for having me. I would like to thank the SRC as well as always for kindly sponsoring me this year. So today we're going to be looking at rural enterprise hubs, which is something that I've been studying for quite some time now. Today I'll be presenting a paper that is the main output of this fellowship that I'm on this year. And we'll be looking at enterprise hubs through the lens of economic geography today. There's several papers coming out this year of various ways of framing rural enterprise hubs, but today we're taking an economic geography stance. So yeah, I'm at the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise and the Centre for Rural Economy at Newcastle University, which are obviously partners with CCRI through NICER as well. So it's great to be able to do this for you today. It's a shame that I couldn't get down there in person, but there we go. There's always time in the future. Next slide. So there's just a very basic overview of what we're going to be doing today. Basically the same way that the paper set out almost. So here is some context. This is the context about how I'm framing this challenge or situation that we find ourselves in. So rural areas are typified of having very high levels of micro businesses and SMEs. You know, this is people, micro businesses are 1 to 9 employees and SMEs are up to 250. But typically of the rural economy, mainly micro businesses, lots of sole traders as well, which fall into this category. You know, additionally on top of that, many of these are home-based as well. So people who are, let's say, supporting a farming business, you know, they typically base their business in the farmhouse. Added to that, there is a general lack of very professional workspaces in rural areas. You know, we don't see this high-end office offer of an inner city, for example. And when we do find them, they tend to be above shops on high streets and things like this, you know, not particularly attractive places to work. There's also a rural premium involved in delivering business support. This is due to, you know, extended distances that business support providers have to travel to go and meet the businesses, and vice versa as well. You know, if a rural business requires business support, it's a sometimes lengthy trip to the city to go and get it. And then also the businesses are quite geographically dispersed, especially compared to a city. You know, we have our market towns and our villages, which do help concentrate the businesses, but you know, generally compared to the city, they're very geographically dispersed, and as a side effect of that, often isolated as well. So that's the sort of context. The challenges that come from that are that there's fewer opportunities for businesses to network in rural areas. There isn't necessarily space for them to grow. And when I'm talking about growing here, I'm talking about employing new staff. You know, you can imagine working from home. You wouldn't necessarily want to hire a member of staff to come to your home every day. Warehousing facilities if you want to start exporting, or IT infrastructure. You know, if you want to start a web-based business or something like that. There tends to be a general lack of access to business support and new knowledge. Knowledge in this sense can mean lots of different things, but the thing that comes to my mind is, you know, a university or another knowledge producing institution. Rural businesses find it very hard to interact with big structures like that unless there's, you know, a particular rural dimension to them. But a lot of rural businesses find it quite daunting going and speaking to a university. And then as a kind of knock-on effect of that, there's a lack of access into innovation ecosystems, something that I could talk about for hours in a separate paper, but not today. So one solution to all of this is rural enterprise hubs, which we're going to be talking about today. This definition here is taken straight out of my paper. So we're defining rural enterprise hubs as the provision of workspaces to multiple tenants, which are co-located with additional services such as shared equipment, meeting rooms, co-working spaces, and business advice and support. So the key thing to think about here is that these are physical infrastructures. You know, this isn't a digital platform. This is a physical place where businesses can go, rent an office, interact with like-minded businesses, have business support provided to them, etc., etc. It's important to note that in the study, we found good examples of private, public, and third sector. You know, that isn't necessarily a determinant of success. We found good examples and possibly not so good examples of all three of these ownerships. They are very similar, but they're also very diverse in different senses. So they do vary in scale quite differently. In this study that we're looking at today, the smallest was 4 tenants, and the biggest was over 50. So it's quite a range. They are also diverse in terms of whether or not they have a sectoral focus, the facilities that they provide, and the services as well. I've listed a few services and facilities there just to get an overall idea of the things that they're offering. So these are just the type of things that help make a business, quote unquote, better. You know, so having a place to go to work, places where you can hire for meeting rooms, having really strong broadband and fast, obviously, as well. And then some of them offer co-working spaces. I think that this will be a trend that we'll see more in the future. And postal addresses as well. You know, a lot of businesses don't necessarily want to have their home address as their business address, and look particularly professional. And then the services as well, these help sort of define what an enterprise hub is compared to a typical office building. So we have business support seminars and residencies from business support offices, receptionist services, digital tenancies, events as well, whether or not these be social or events to bring in the public to have a look at the hub, for example. So this is the theoretical framework that we're going to be looking at today. This is where it gets a bit dense, so apologies for that. The idea of clustering and an agglomeration, the idea that co-locating businesses in the same sector can help to give a competitive regional advantage. I've put some of the kind of very well recognized key authors in there, dating all the way back to Marshall in 1920 with the Economies of Scale thesis. You know, if we think of Silicon Valley, this is a very good example and the textbook example of clustering and agglomeration, where if you get a lot of high-tech businesses together who are all in the market of, you know, silicon chips and Google, Airbnb, all of these different businesses, there's something important about being there in that area. You know, the human capital, sharing of resources, the sharing of knowledge, you know, poaching ideas off people as well. All of these things happen in innovation hotspots and in, you know, in areas where there is co-location of similar sectors. Leading on from that, there's the idea around proximity as a framing as well. Geographic proximity is the underlying rationale for all of this. So, you know, we bring businesses together closer physically to each other. They're more likely to share knowledge, network, share human capital, etc., etc. However, that is not the end all and be all of proximity. Boschmer in 2005 wrote a seminal paper explaining how proximity is multifaceted, and there's various different forms of proximity. However, we'll see in a second that there is still an underlying fascination of geographic proximity as being the driver behind all of this. But very quickly, here are some of the other forms of proximity. So there's cognitive proximity, where two people share similar knowledge bases, have an understanding of the shared language that they use, etc. Social, which is based around friendships and kinships. A low social proximity would be that people don't know each other or don't get along with each other. Organizational, this one's an interesting one. So this is when businesses share similar business structures or networks. The literature sort of frames this around like departments. So, if you have a big multinational, they have an HR department, they have a marketing department, an R&D department. So the way that businesses organize can demonstrate that they share proximity with each other. Institutional, so this can be hard or soft institutions. Soft institutions are norms and social norms and cultures, around entrepreneurial spirit, things like this. But then there's also harder forms of institutions which are tied into innovation ecosystems and innovation systems in general. Yes, which are, your knowledge producing institutions, your business support providers, local enterprise partnerships, things like this. And then we also have communicational proximity, which is bringing people together through communication, through ICT, or through a thing called temporary proximity, which is, around conferences, trade fairs, things like that. To nuance that slightly, there are a number of kind of critical assumptions that the literature makes of rural areas regarding each of those proximities. So, it's very easy to understand why there is a general rationale in the literature that suggests that rural areas have low levels of proximity, therefore low levels of clustering potential or low levels of agglomeration potential. As a knock-on effect of that, cities are always viewed as the best place to start a high-growth business or to innovate. And rural areas are generally seen as ordinary and uncompetitive because of this underlying rationale around physical proximity. For social proximity, a lot of the literature revolves around granovetter and embeddedness and strength of weak ties arguments. Rural businesses are sometimes considered to be well established, well embedded, possibly even more embedded than in urban context. But sometimes isolated as well at the same time. Home-based businesses working in the countryside, you could see how they were not very well embedded. There's also a sort of underlying assumption that there's more strong ties using granovetter again, because professional and social networks overlap. But because of this, there might be fewer weaker ties. And I'm hoping that everybody has an understanding of granovetter's weak ties theory. In cognitive proximity, there is an underlying assumption that the traditional land-based rural sectors, forestry, agriculture, mining, they have shared knowledge bases between the different enterprises, especially in farming. There's a lot of work done on providing farmers with the information that they need, things like this. However, rural economies in general are far more diverse than just these land-based sectors. And they don't necessarily share cognitive proximity bases. Around institutionals, a lot of these innovation systems and knowledge producing institutions, etc., are based in urban areas. They serve urban areas and don't really speak the language of rural business, and they find it hard to interact with. Therefore, most rural areas are considered as institutionally thin. Communicational proximity, there's the typical discourse that rural areas lack broadband, therefore cannot compete in the information age. And organizational proximity, rural businesses are micro businesses and they tend to be too small to form departmental structures. So, the literature, when looking at economic geography and looking at proximity, are not particularly very favoursome towards rural areas as a place for high growth businesses or entrepreneurial spirit or innovation. So this kind of led us to the question of how do rural enterprise hubs support rural businesses through these different beneficial forms of proximity. This is what we're going to explore. Here's the methodology quickly. The study was based in the northeast of England, framed through the rural growth network pilots that were occurring at the time. I know that there was also one around Warwickshire, I believe, as well. So there were 3 of these, I seem to remember, across England, and this was a way to experiment with new forms of growth in rural areas. And one of the underlying themes that cut through was the funding and support of rural enterprise hubs. So the Northeast Rural Growth Network kindly partnered with me for this study. Generally, I started from the top and worked my way down. So we started with regional development officers who were in strategic and policy making positions in the local enterprise partnership, rural growth network, universities, colleges, public sector authorities who were in charge of managing, large parts of their infrastructure portfolio, things like this. And this was to try and get an overview of kind of strategic overview of where they considered rural enterprise hubs to fit into the region and to fit into the business support offer and to fit into the innovation system as well. From there, I chose 8 case studies, which were a hub each, tried to spread out geographically as much as possible. So these covered Northumberland and rural County Durham. The rationale for choosing these was based on ownership. So I picked 4 private sector, 2 public sector, 2 third sector. Management strategies. I'm not going to get into this too much today, but very, very loosely, Hive rural enterprise hubs are based around business to business tenants, whereas honeypots are based around business to customer. So customer facing retail, tourism, service providers, things like that. And then the last thing that I sampled for was heterogeneity. So whether or not tenant bases looked like they were forming around certain sectors or whether or not they were very diverse. I spent a week in each hub, interviewed the hub manager and interviewed 5 tenants in each hub and tried to get a good mixture of businesses as well. And we were discussing what benefits were of being in the hub. And as we'll see in the analysis, especially compared to what their previous working situation was, many of which were based at home. I used in vivo for the analysis, and we set up a coding framework based around the various forms of proximity that we've just discussed, and coding to them, and then within them open coding to kind of pull out more of these. So basically for the findings, we're going to go through each form of proximity and discuss how that relates to businesses operating in rural enterprise hubs. So one of the strongest findings was around organizational proximity. Running a micro business as a sole trader is particularly challenging. I think it's something that we don't necessarily put enough emphasis on in the rural studies literature, but if you're a sole trader, you're expected to be the marketing department, the finance department, the HR department, well, not necessarily the HR department, but you get what I mean, that there's a lot of different skills that you need to be able to have to be a business owner where you're operating by yourself. And a lot of the time, some of these tasks take away from the actual core vision and operations of the business. So people moving into the hub, they found very quickly that they could employ the skills of other tenants to help them with their own business. Accountancy, web design and marketing were 3 that definitely came out the strongest. And we also found that accountants and website designers deliberately wanted to move into these hubs because they get a customer base themselves, so it's a symbiotic relationship. There's a nice little quote here that I think it summarizes it quite well, and this is showing that the people that they employed in the hub, they weren't necessarily the cheapest, but they felt a sense of loyalty and they felt a sense of wanting to make sure that other businesses in the hub succeeded as well. So yeah, sort of formal collaborations forming in the sense that one tenant hired the other tenant to perform some sort of task to help them improve their business. As direct effect of entering into the hub, the tenants' networks became much bigger, and having a diverse and strong network is one way of compensating for the fact that you don't have a departmental structure. So they found that their networks got considerably bigger. They formed new network um, new network connections, either informally on a day-to-day basis, what the literature sometimes calls water cooler moments, where you're sitting there having a coffee and suddenly find out that your fellow tenant is doing something that you needed for your own business, and then also through formal networking groups that the hubs host as well. So this would be a kind of dinner time or an afternoon or a breakfast kind of affair where people will just get into a room together and network for half an hour or an hour over a coffee. There were some examples of actual formal collaborations forming as well. These were fewer than perhaps the agglomeration literature would suggest for an inner city hub. But there were a few cases, and when these cases did occur, both businesses were found to have grown considerably because of that and had gone on to employ staff. Cognitive proximity. This was an interesting one when we framed the idea of knowledge bases, which is the typical sort of underlying rationale for all of this in the economic geography literature. We discovered that the tenants were in a similar situation structurally, similar to what we were discussing in the previous slide, but they all had very similar challenges associated with being a sole or micro business operating in a rural area. And because of this, some of them had quite ingenious ways of overcoming these challenges, which they shared through what we're calling entrepreneurial knowledge. So instead of this being sector specific, which is like a knowledge-based rationale, an entrepreneurial knowledge base is more around generic advice about operating a business, let's say. We also found that the role of the management is absolutely key in brokering some of these arrangements as well. So if the managers have a good understanding of what all of the tenants do, they can make sure that they kind of broker these relationships and make sure if somebody comes to them with a particular challenge, that they can partner them with another business to discuss it or potentially collaborate over it. Here's another quote just sort of demonstrating that role that the management board has in one of these particular hubs. I would say that this was universal across all of the hubs that we studied. Communication proximity. Obviously, a lot of people working from home especially in rural areas, don't necessarily have strong broadband connection. You couldn't imagine sort of hosting a cloud-based internet business or something like that on a rural broadband connection. But the hubs provided these. Sometimes had to go to the extreme of getting satellite connections. But this is crucial. If they don't have broadband, they won't have tenants. So it's important for them to have that. But we also found that communication between the business support system and the tenants greatly improved as well. We can consider hubs to be a platform for business support to go out through, and also policies in general as well. So yeah, workshops, seminars, drop-ins, networking events, all of these things that the business support agencies needed to deliver, they found much easier to deliver and much more effective when they had a platform of businesses, that they could go to and know that there'll be 10 engaged businesses there, not necessarily have to collect them all into one place. And again, the role of the managers in this, as we will continue to see throughout these slides, is vital in all of this. Institutional proximity, again, we need to frame this in two different ways, but soft institutions, which are cultures and norms, again, if you think of Silicon Valley, there's a definite culture around high growth, very fast high growth, and also a culture around failure as well. Some of these businesses fail these entrepreneurs fail 2 or 3 times before they kind of strike gold as such. And in rural areas, business attitude tends to be a little bit more conservative than that. There's not necessarily that attitude that to fail is okay, because there's a reputation involved, and some of your professional contacts also being your friends, and not necessarily wanting to look like a failure in front of them. But we identified that there was definite growth-orientated tenants, but there was also a group of steady-state tenants who weren't necessarily didn't have that attitude that they wanted to suddenly become, a global competitive company. But the hub did encourage them to, become more professional, have more of a growth attitude around sort of just generally becoming more of a professional outfit, looking at starting to employ staff. And, as this quote shows as well, helping the soft skills and the confidence around operating a business. Some of the hubs that I went into were high percentages of women entrepreneurs, including this quote here, in fact, and this shows that being able to be part of a group makes them realize that they're not doing this on their own. They can have the confidence to keep going and succeed in business. As far as hard institutions are concerned, the hubs helped the businesses to become more visible to some of these very big urban institutions through kind of clustering and these big institutions being able to go, if I go over here, I can suddenly find 20 businesses who have made the step to leave the home environment. So they want, they're committed, and they're committed to their business and to growth. And there is a route into the innovation ecosystem through this. I think that this needs to be exploited a bit more in the future, to be honest. I think some of the hubs haven't quite got this in their thinking, that this is like an important thing for them to do, but this is something that we'll be working on in the future through impact activities and things like this. Social proximity, I haven't put too much down for this because I've written an entirely different paper about the well-being effects on the tenants. This was a huge finding as far as well-being is concerned. Many of the tenants felt socially isolated and low before entering the hub. I've only put one quote here, but I've got lists and lists of quotes of tenants suggesting that they've made really good friends. It helps them get through the day to be able to go and talk to people on coffee breaks, things like this. It helps produce social cohesion when the managers put on social events as well, especially if a new tenant arrives. There was a couple of examples of managers throwing, a bit of a welcome party and introducing them all to the other tenants. And then shared kitchens being, absolutely essential facilities to help facilitate some of these bonds of kinship and whatnot. So this was a very strong finding, but I haven't dedicated too much time to this in this presentation today. So amongst those forms of proximity in the economic geography literature, we found that there was also a couple of extra ones that tenants were mentioning quite a lot of the time. The idea of market proximity, which is something that if you're in an urban area, you might not necessarily think about too much because you have lots of customers up there all of the time. But for a lot of rural businesses, particularly those that are customer-facing B2C businesses, they don't have a lot of footfall. They don't have a lot of people showing up out of the blue wanting to look at their goods or whatnot. So particularly in honeypot hubs, this idea of becoming closer to the customer was something that we didn't necessarily anticipate. This was one of the codes that came out through the open coding phase, where it didn't neatly fit into one of the other boxes, but very, very important for rural areas, I would say. Professional proximity as well. We've touched upon this in other slides, but the increased sense of professionalism internally within the tenant themselves, feeling the confidence and feeling the positive effects of leaving the home environment, putting on a shirt for the day, sitting down at an office, and also being around other people that are also feeling that heightened sense of professionalism. And then also to customers as well. So, we had several participants saying that they really wanted to meet their clients, but they felt really uncomfortable inviting them to their home and not looking very professional at all. Have potential clients come in to talk to you about potentially quite a big contract, and showing up and finding out that it's your house that you're operating in. So this professional proximity, this being closer to operating in professional environments, we found was important. And then the separation from home as well. I did this research in 2017. I'm not that old, and this was kind of pre-pandemic. But 70% of the people I interviewed were previously home working, and a lot of them framed their experience of the hub through leaving the home environment. Separation from home, proximity to professional business environment, basically, gave them a better work-life balance, helped to avoid distractions, and as I've mentioned throughout this talk, it's tied to other forms of proximity in different ways. I think that this might be something that we start considering a lot more going forwards as well, now that the entire world has had to, become adapted to working in a home environment, and seeing some of the negative effects that can have on well-being, business performance, etc. That these rural businesses don't have a choice in for a lot of the time. If there literally is nowhere that you can rent an office within 15 miles, 20 miles, then the only choice you have is to work from home. So I think that this is something that at the time seemed somewhat novel to rural areas, which the pandemic has kind of shone a light on for the rest, particularly urban residents. So yeah, just quickly on the discussion, there's a couple of forms of proximity there that we've discussed in the previous slide that aren't necessarily raised in the economic geography literature. There's a couple of forms of proximity that seem particularly salient in rural areas, and that's organisational, market, and social proximity, which we've discussed today. There's a couple of ways that rural hubs differ from urban hubs. I think this needs exploring further as well, but the homogeneity of tenants in the literature, in the economic literature, suggests that you have to have sectoral clustering for these things to really work. So we look at the motorsport industry in Cambridge or Silicon Valley with their web-based businesses. We found that in rural areas it was far more diverse than that, and these were businesses from all different sectors. And there's a concept in economic geography called related variety, which I think, related diversity, that we need to discuss and explore more, which is the idea that you can have businesses that are diverse, but they can still be related to each other somehow. Kind of similar to the slide that I showed on cognitive proximity, where we reframed it around entrepreneurial knowledge, and then all of a sudden all of these businesses have lots of things in common. Whereas, if we took a typical narrow view of what that would be, then according to economic geography, all of these hubs would be a failure as such, because they weren't producing these sectoral links. The ambitions of the tenants, again, in the clustering literature, they suggest that everybody has to be high growth for these clusters to work. Whereas, in rural, I would say that it was close to a 50-50 split of growth oriented to steady state. So we need to consider this more going forwards as well. We need to consider that these clusters aren't 100% people that want to, grow their business to be the next multinational or whatever that might incur. And then also high percentages of previously home-based businesses, which a lot of urban clusters don't have either. So there's three differences that we notice between urban and rural hubs. The role of the hub manager is crucial. I'm going to move on to one more slide in a minute that will help explain that. And then the social, institutional, geographic barriers of conducting business in rural areas tends to be the discourse in the entrepreneurial literature, at least, that we base barriers around these three themes. And I believe that the rural enterprise hubs can help overcome barriers in all three of these groups of challenges. Just to quickly, this is really quickly, each of these bullet points is a paper in the writing or in review at the minute. But this is just to show some of the different framings that I've been looking at over the past year through the fellowship. So the well-being paper I co-authored with a number of authors, but one in particular was a well-being specialist from a psych department. And we use self-determination theory to analyze the data using autonomy, competence, relatedness. Such a strong finding, you know, from all three of these. Almost all of the tenants talked about well-being, not necessarily directly, but indirectly, all of them discussed well-being in some shape or form. The determinants of success of the hub grouped around external and internal. External is around sort of market analysis, policies, the surrounding ecosystem, etc. But the internal determinant of success is almost entirely focused on the hub manager, whether or not that be their management attitude, how proactive they are, how flexible they are in meeting tenant demands, and the choice that they make in the services and facilities that they provide, going out and finding business support, etc., etc. Me and a fellow colleague at NICE, Fran Rowe, have co-authored a paper around honeypots being creative microclusters, and how evidence coming out of the Policy Evidence Centre at the minute is showing that there's lots and lots of creative microclusters around the country that previous methodologies haven't uncovered as such. So we've used their findings and provided a complementary qualitative analysis to their quantitative analysis. And then the role of enterprise hubs in territorial innovation models, which is for those who are into their very dry economic geography, which I won't bore you with today. But I find very interesting, and I'm writing a paper with some members of the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University, who are world renowned in economic geography. So I'm very excited to be co-authoring the paper with scholars from there as well. So I think that brings us to the end. Yeah, conclusions. Going forwards, and hubs are critical infrastructures for supporting the rural economy. You know, we were discussing yesterday in a meeting with NICE the various themes that we have, and the hubs seem to incorporate all of these different themes into physical infrastructures. They could also be key infrastructures and helping to contribute towards policy agendas around building back better and levelling up. I've gone through the 8 forms of proximity that they proved to be beneficial today. And then in future research, I'm currently putting together a new proposal to study these for a further 3 years, involving quantitative, longitudinal data, and to study them in more contexts, and also to consider what effects COVID-19 has had on rural enterprise hubs, flexible work patterns, and co-working spaces in general. So I'll leave it there for today. There's a few contact details there if you want to reach out. And I think we've got about 15 minutes left for questions as well. So that was unfinished, but
well, thank you very much, Ian. Spot on time here. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure it raised many questions as well. So I'll hand over to Julie to go through the questions that are in the chat. And then if we have any questions and you would like to ask questions in person, please use the hand icon to raise your hand first. So it's to you, Julie, now.
Thank you. I'll go down them in order. Charlotte was first. She was asking about the popularity of cafes that act as informal rural hubs. Well, they act as informal hubs in urban settings, but is this also happening in the rural environment?
Yeah, great. I'm just having a look at the great question. Let's have a think about this. I would say maybe 40% of the hubs had a cafe as part of their sort of operations. The honeypots, which are the ones that are more concerned with attracting businesses in, are dedicated a lot larger space to that, and most of them provided that space to a tenant cafe rather than managing it themselves. There were examples of managers managing the cafe, but again, it's another way of getting another business in to manage that. And yeah, like a very important part of clustering and agglomeration is getting together and having informal chats over coffee, over lunch. You know, I think that a lot of people see this kind of transient worker who sits in the corner of Starbucks using their free Wi-Fi or whatever. It's quite an urban thing, and a few of the businesses try to kind of create that dynamic to less effect, I would say. At least in 2017, I think that the world's gone through, you know, a transition that has, you know, potentially completely thrown this out the window, and the rural co-working could be a massive thing going forwards, and in which case, you know, we would see an increase of, you know, businesses in the corner of cafes. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Going on to the next question from Chris Short. How did the rural hubs determine their location? Was it suitable premises, lack of choice, or a calculation on the catchment threshold of suitable micro and SMEs?
Great question, Chris. It was a combination of different things. A couple of the public sector ones were suffering from budget cuts, had to lose quite a lot of members of staff, but suddenly had a lot of office space lying around, or, you know, businesses that went out of business in the financial crash, for example, as well. You know, that there was a lot of kind of grow on space in the public sector. That's quite a strong discourse in the sort of 90s and noughties. So yeah, the public sector ones, a lot of the time we're trying to reuse empty buildings and try and pull in revenue streams to sort of counter budget cuts. Private sector ones, they tended to be more on the looking for a prime location, you know, looking at affluent communities, looking at disused buildings and trying to acquire them. Or there was a couple of cases of people that were running like wedding venues and things like that, realized that that market had become very oversaturated and wanted to move into other things using the building that they already had. And these were kind of like stately homes, estates, things like this, farmers that had a spare barn, you know, these sort of things. Third sector ones, again, tended to use disused spaces in infrastructure that they already had. So yeah, as far as the actual location is concerned, I think that the private sector ones were the only ones that really had the ability to choose where they wanted to set up their hubs. You know, if they had that financial freedom of we're coming into the market to buy a new property to turn into a hub, they were the only ones that kind of had that flexibility. What was the second one?
The next was your reference to Silicon Valley and not to other regions where there are different rural-urban relationships. Perhaps Matt wants to expand on that, because you might not be familiar with his examples of Flanders or Veneto.
Yeah, just simple difference in that Silicon Valley is often used as an example of agglomeration, but of course it was a rural area until it got built up by Silicon Valley. So perhaps it answers our own question. But the Veneto and Flanders are great examples of where rural businesses have become tightly integrated with other businesses, and it's a very different spatial pattern. So you would find a farm next to a factory, and the factory could well be owned or financed by the farm. So there's a tighter integration of farming and other industries, and this is partly historic, but also partly directly encouraged by local policy. So it's a different model of rural agglomeration. And I just sort of think that the difficulty is with the sort of Anglo-American model, it could be a bit self-fulfilling prophecy in that, you know, you boost the idea of urban advantage. So you invest in urban areas. So that's where you get high growth. And then it makes rural areas look residual. Whereas there are other examples that might be worth pursuing.
I completely agree. I was trying to paint a picture in the presentation there of what the kind of typical situation is that the rural geography literature has placed us into this position now that, you know, after 20 years, 30 years of looking into it, that that we find ourselves in a situation where there's a fascination around physical geography. And Silicon Valley is always one that I like to use, you know, for lay experts that don't have, you know, a thorough understanding of agglomeration theory. It helps them picture it. You know, I read a fascinating paper a few weeks ago about saying that Silicon Valley, even though, yeah, it was completely rural, is now the kind of model for urban regional development, which is ironic in itself. But good to know, though, Matt, and I will take that into note for future presentations. Thank you.
Janet, would you like to expand on your question about economies of scope?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Thanks, Ian, for a great presentation with lots of food for thought. Yeah, I kind of notice in the respect to the way that successful rural businesses operate is you often see a greater scope in terms of the business offer because of the spatial distances between businesses. So, you know, one thing opens up selling some type of product and then ends up doing a lot of other things at the same time, because if it's successful, then it wants to meet customers' needs, which are diverse. I wondered what the impact of being in these centres would be on the micro businesses, whether it means they don't have to do that, or whether you saw examples where they would equally, because of the interchange between proximal micro businesses, whether they also exhibited economies of scope in their business development.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought that you know, we always have this kind of idea that the rural towns in particular, you're always kind of fishing in quite a small pond, and you know, there's one accountant and they serve the town. You know, the next town over has an accountant and they serve that town, or a dentist or whatever it might be. And yeah, it's interesting to think about this as well, isn't it? It's interesting to think of whether or not these economies of scope can happen at the hub level, at the town level, the regional level. Plenty of food for thought there. I'm sorry that I can't give you a direct answer to that one. I'll take note though. Thank you.
A couple of questions from Jasmine here. Do you think local councils have a role to play in setting these up and advertising to get a diversity of businesses? And have you seen any experience of enterprise hubs supporting or restructuring, shortening food supply chains?
Interesting. So yes, the Rural Growth Network that I sort of hinted at in the context section at the start, that was a public-private partnership. So yeah, Northumberland County Council and Durham County Council had direct roles in setting up a few of these, and they were managed by the local authorities. You know, they had local authority staff manning them, managing them, providing the business support. And, you know, out of all of those hubs that I studied, the public sector ones clearly outperformed other hubs in terms of providing networking groups, providing business support opportunities, whereas the private sector ones were, sometimes they would if they had a good manager, or sometimes it wasn't on their agenda at all, really. Shortening food supply chains, yeah. There's a couple that I could send you information on, which were ex-farm businesses. Well, or still, you know, the farm is still going, and they kind of have this like, field to plate or whatever it might be. So they've taken the produce that they've grown, they sell them to a number of tenant businesses who then go in. So.
Thanks. Gordon Morris asks, how much interest have you had from DEFRA/Biz? Yeah.
Thanks, Gordon. Good to see you again. I just got a bit alarmed then. Oh, yeah. I think you might be muted. Oh.
Oh yeah, Gordon, are you muted?
Oh, no, sorry. I just say, yes, good to see you as well, Ian, and thanks a lot. I guess what I was hinting, well, I'm harking back in a way to the days of DEFRA's Rural Communities Policy Unit, and before that business links and what have you, and wondering if there's any central government or Wango-ish interest in the work you're doing.
Yeah, there has been. There was the House of Lords Select Committee on the Rural Economy, which Jeremy and Janet went to present, and some of the evidence was around rural enterprise hubs, and they've taken that on board, whatever that means. And yeah, you know, going forwards, one of the things that I want to do is to work with NICE's new policy advisor, Ulrike, who's actually in the call today, to actually start planning a more targeted strategy around particularly BEIS and the industrial strategy, but DEFRA as well, Department for Digital Connectivity and Media, all of these different people. I think it is quite a cross-cutting theme. Well, the infrastructure itself cross-cuts quite a lot of different policies. So yeah, it's trying to work out who to target and how. But yeah, there is some interest. Yeah, unfortunately, the Rural Growth Network pilot evaluation seemed to get put on the shelf and not necessarily followed up on. But they evaluated it very highly, SQW, but not sure the true extent of whether or not people actually listen to that report or not. That might be me just getting a bit too cynical.
Okay, all right, thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks.
Martin, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask something?
Yes, I was just going to add in a really interesting discussion, Ian, so thank you for the presentation. I'm based in North Wales, and I run a food innovation hub, and we engage with 200 businesses plus a year. And I was just going to add to the question about the nature of whether the supply chains have changed, and anecdotally from the businesses you can see that a lot of the farm businesses have diversified, a lot of interest in that whole hyper-local market, and those new models have been really accelerated throughout COVID in terms of direct to consumer. And we're also in the process of a North Wales growth deal bid where we're developing a rural economy hub in the land-based college that we run. So it's quite an interesting discussion, which I might pick up with you again, Ian, offline, if that's okay.
Yeah, certainly. Give me an email, and I'll find you on Twitter and LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
We've got a couple of comments about Ireland, but no specific questions. You might want to check those out. Janet, you had a question about cafes as well. craft centres as honeypots.
Yeah.
Did your micro businesses also use these sorts of country events to promote businesses?
Interesting, yeah. So a few of the honeypots had a particular arts and crafts theme to them as well, and they ran a gallery on the side, so they would have exhibitions, rolling exhibitions that would either bring in someone semi-famous, you know, regionally famous or nationally famous, alongside you know, exhibitions from the tents themselves as well, and other members of the community, music events, social events, you know, community hubs. I think that it's all tied in, yeah. I've just realised how many questions we've got.
There are actually comments.
Yes, but we are quite short of time now. Yeah.
There's dialogue going on which you don't necessarily have to respond to. Yes, I was going to say that's probably the last question now. We're at 1:15. So
well, I'm okay to keep going, but
yes, but we we are quite limited on this, but it's fascinating, and obviously I'll save the chat as well as the recording, and I think there'll be an opportunity to follow this up, because certainly this has been you know, a fascinating discussion, and I think we are just at the start of it. So I do apologize for maybe cutting in, but we are limited with the time.
No problem. I'm just having a quick read through there, and Richard, if you want to give me an email about it, we can start a dialogue around MHCLG. But yeah, that's great. Thanks for the comments and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ian, once again, also for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the seminar. As always, we will place the recording on the YouTube, and I'm sure that, you know, in the near future we might have a follow-up, because Ian's got a very interesting set of papers in the pipeline. So I think there might be some interesting presentation from those as well. And for the next seminar, we have another one listed for the 14th of October, Dr. Jack Watkins, talking about the Foundation Economy project in Wales. So you're most welcome. We will obviously put all the information with the link on the Eventbrite, and also please check the CCRI website for all the information that you need, either about this seminar or the following ones. So thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye then.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.